Hello, everybody. It's time for our parenting book club. I am going to just hang on for another minute or so as people are logging on. If you are on here now, just make sure to say hello. I would also let you know that if you can authorize StreamYard to look at your Facebook profile, you will, when you comment or ask a question, you will be automatically entered in a live raffle giveaway that will be at the end of this broadcast. So make sure you do that. If you don't, it won't pull in the Facebook user generic ones. So I just wanted to make sure you know that. So I'm so excited because I have not done a live for a little bit. As you know, we transitioned from live broad stream to podcast. So I am so glad to be back here in the studio with you tonight. And so those of you, I'm just going to remind you, if you have been reading along, or even if you haven't, but you have a child who is struggling with anxiety, please make sure to jump in and take a listen. And don't be shy, ask some questions. So I am going to just go ahead, and I see some people logging in. Make sure, again, authorize that StreamYard account, please, so that you can be entered into the raffle. I'm so excited to see some of you logging on. Okay. So as you know, I'm Dr. Narissa Bauer, your host. I'm a behavioral pediatrician and CEO of Let's Talk Kids Health. And as you know, as part of this show, have always wanted to share information about behavioral health, parenting, and family wellness by interviewing guests to help me advance this mission so that we can all talk together. Now, this is a special episode of our Parenting Book Club with Dr. Eli Lebowitz. I know I mispronounced that. I'm so sorry. So Professor Lebowitz, no, tell me
Yes.
one more time.
Yeah.
Lebowitz, yes. Studies and treats childhood and adolescent anxiety at the Yale Child Study Center. Now, his research focuses on the development, neurobiology, and treatment of anxiety and related disorders, with special emphasis on family dynamics and the role of parents. Now, he is the lead investigator on multiple funded research projects and is the author of research papers, books, and chapters on childhood and adolescent anxiety. He is also the father of 3 wonderful boys. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm so excited to talk to you tonight.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
Yes. So you might not know this, but when I left academia and I went into private practice, I was doing parenting groups, and then COVID happened. And then I realized very quickly could not do that the way that we wanted to. So that's why I transitioned to a parenting book club. And I will tell you, your book came highly recommended by Bridget Flynn Walker, who we also read one of her books. And when I read this book, I was like, okay, I understand why Bridget would recommend this. It is so well written. And I almost felt like I could hear you talking in such a welcoming voice for parents, because it's not easy when you feel very just really upset because your child has anxiety. You can feel panic as well. But I felt like you had a very calm writing style, very clear, and always like, you can do this. This is how you're going to do this. Remember, parents, you can do it. So I just have to say, I really enjoyed this book.
Thank you very much. That is very kind.
Of course. So for those of you logging on, I see you're on. Please make sure to authorize StreamYard and go ahead and start dropping in any questions or comments. We want to make sure that we make use of the time that we have with the author today. So I'm going to go ahead and start, maybe, if I may, just to ask you, what really drove you to write this book?
What drove me to write this book? Well, this is a book that I've been wanting to write for a long time, actually, because in the past, when I wrote books, I wrote typically for a more professional reader, if you will, like a therapist, a doctor, somebody who's doing treatment. And even those books, when I wrote them, I tried to make them readable for anybody so that, if you're a parent, you could pick it up and find some information. But I really wanted to have the opportunity to just speak directly to parents, because so many parents are coping with anxiety in their kids, and it's such a challenge. It's so difficult, and there's so many dilemmas that come with it. And so I really wanted to have the opportunity to be able to just, speak directly. And then another part of it is also, this book is trying to help you to solve a problem. And we know that not everybody is going to have easy access to, work with a therapist, maybe. And even before COVID, and definitely since COVID, finding a therapist who's skilled and knowledgeable, or even just finding a therapist at all in many places,
Yes.
many times, is very difficult and very challenging. And so even though a book can't always be a full substitute for therapy for many parents and for many kids, it actually is going to go a long way toward that. And so I really wanted to have something that would be, anybody can just pick up no matter where you live. And, it's an audio book, it's an ebook, it's a paper book. You can just read it however you like and be able to get help, even if you maybe don't have access to, professional care.
Mm-hmm. I will say, it is so hands-on with the worksheets and how you reference it. Again, I think it's a great starting point for a lot of families who are just feeling like, I need something. And oh my gosh, the wait list is 6 months. We cannot keep going down this route. So like I said, I think this book is just a really great resource out there, and it should be on everybody's parenting library. All the pediatricians should have it because it's very thoughtful. So I'm going to go ahead and launch in with some questions that we've gotten from some readers that were sent in previously. But again, if you're watching live, please do not hesitate to go ahead and put your comments or questions in, and I will ask this for you. Okay. So I have a kiddo. This comes from a mom. She said, how do you specifically, let me think, hold on. What are some of the less common signs of anxiety that are easy to overlook based on your expertise and experience working with families of kids with anxiety?
That's actually a really good question.
I thought it was too.
It really is. I should say to everybody who's listening that I didn't see these questions in advance. So you're hearing me think out loud about these questions, but I think that's actually a really good one, because anxiety, more than many other disorders, can actually fly under the radar for a very long time. And we know that it actually isn't detected quickly enough or identified quickly enough in many, many, many cases. And there's a lot of implications to that. For example, we should probably do more screening for anxiety. We should do it in schools, and we should do it in primary care, and we should be aware of it. But one of the, if you think about some of the other disorders, like if your child has really bad ADHD, for example, that's going to likely call attention to itself. Maybe they're going to be disruptive in class. Maybe they're going to be struggling academically, or maybe at home things are going to be really hectic and organization is so hard. But you can have anxiety for a long time without people actually noticing. So what are some signs? One thing that I think, it's not so much that it's overlooked, but that it's misinterpreted. Because many people have a kind of mental image of what an anxious child might look like, right? You close your eyes and imagine an anxious child. What are you imagining? Maybe you're imagining somebody, looking really scared or shy, or looking away and cowering in a corner. I don't know. Maybe that's like kind of like an anxious person. And that is going to be true for some kids, but it's also not going to be true for other kids. And what I'm really driving at here is that anxiety can manifest in externalizing ways, just like it can manifest in fear and avoidance. And so oftentimes when a child has anxiety, but it manifests, for example, through aggression, through temper tantrums, these things are not easy to always look at and think, oh, that might be anxiety.
Right.
It always strikes me as remarkable that everybody that I meet knows the phrase fight or flight. And yet so often people forget that half of that is fight. And that means that anxiety can prime us for avoidance with feelings of fear, but it can also prime us for aggression. Now, other things that we might overlook, rigidity, for example, doesn't look like fear, but is often a manifestation of anxiety. So a child who's really rigid about things, really adheres to patterns in a really strict way, things like that, that can be a sign of anxiety. Changes in your general kind of life patterns, like your sleep or your eating or things like that could be, they're not always going to be signs of anxiety, but they can be signs of anxiety as well. Sometimes we might see things like a stutter or nightmares are probably not that easily overlooked. Probably people do understand that that might be linked to anxiety, but it's another kind of symptom that might show up. Because the real bottom line here is that anxiety is very heterogeneous. It looks really different in different people.
Mm-hmm.
So and so we shouldn't really just be kind of fixated on one style of anxiety and assume that everything else is not.
Right, right. And thank you for sharing that. And that, I think how you phrased it, fight or flight, that really sort of encapsulates that. I have another sort of comment, and thanks for those sending in. If you can remember to authorize StreamYard so that we have your name for the drawing. So someone else sent in something about, how until recently, some of their son's behavior struggles were related to anxiety, ADHD. She's still getting over the guilt of that because she had missed some of those behaviors and attributed to something else, especially the aggression piece. Is there an age-appropriate way to talk about behavior as a result of anxiety, especially with a first grader? In particular, recognizing we are worried in the first place, and how to talk with kids about that.
That's a great question also. And I would say even before, I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to say something as a preemptive about that, or prefacing it a little bit. And that is, one of the best ways to be able to have those kinds of conversation with your kids is to have a home atmosphere and a home environment or climate in which we talk about our feelings, in which we talk about challenges or struggles, and we talk about the good things, and we also talk about the bad things. And that means modeling it as a parent as well. A lot of times as parents, especially with young children, we kind of want to give the sense that I'm always fine. I'm always okay. And, we want to be strong for the child. And when your kid is really small, it's easy to kind of be a little Superman-y in their eyes. But when you do that, you're also kind of unwittingly teaching them that that's the expectation, and that other kinds of conversations are less acceptable. And then when you want them to open up and tell you how they're feeling, it's not that surprising that children are a little bit more hesitant to do it. So I would say, this starts day one, right? Like when you have your dinner table conversation, sometimes it can be about, all the successes, but it can also be about the challenges. And that goes for you yourself as the parent. Now, in terms of actually talking to the child, I think you can think about the content and you can think about the format of the conversation. And what I mean by format is be calm yourself, right? Don't approach this in a high stress kind of way. Children are quite perceptive. And if you come into it with a lot of worry, like was mentioned in the question, and you're communicating, I'm so worried, it charges that conversation a little bit more than you might want. And so, take a deep breath yourself, check yourself, pick a moment when both you and the child are a little bit calmer. Many conversations are best delayed. Sometimes the moment that you observe something is not the best moment to actually talk about that thing. And the more anxious your child is, the less open they're going to be to thinking about things and contemplating and reflecting. So maybe wait for tomorrow or the weekend or a time when you can be a little bit calmer. And then in terms of the content, I think you can talk to children about anything. I really do. I think children are fully capable at age 6 and even younger of having conversations about anxiety. It's a question of choosing words that your child knows, right, that are age appropriate, and approaching it in a child-friendly way. But I see no reason not to have a conversation with a child about anxiety. If you have concern, it's okay to address that. At the same time, I would say maybe start with a curious approach rather than like an I know kind of approach. Like I'm worried already sort of presupposes I know there's a problem, and you could start with a more curious kind of approach. Like just ask some questions and see where they are leading you, and also see what kind of words they use so that you could use those words as well.
Right.
And if there really is a problem that you want to address, you could give an example of, like, I noticed yesterday that, or last week it occurred to me that you seen, or something. What do you think about it? And just taking that kind of calm, not too emotional, but sort of interested approach. I think you can talk to kids about anxiety 100%. I do that with my own kids and also professionally.
Yes. And thank you for voicing that. I too so wholeheartedly agree with you that you can talk to kids about anything, but I love that you started with like process your own feelings, because if you approach it, I feel like if you're kind of stressed out and anxious yourself, they're going to feel that. We mirror our kids' emotions so much. And so that's such an important point. And I love that, thinking about child-friendly words to use as well. There are a lot of comments coming in right now, so I am going to share some of these right now. So I'm going to kind of order them kind of where I see fit. So if I don't ask your question first, even though it's listed first, do not worry. I see it. Okay. So somebody asked this here. So going off that question about the signs of anxiety, what are some early signs of OCD?
That's a very interesting question. Part of what makes it an interesting one is that a certain amount of OCD-like symptoms is normal in the general population and in young children, because the question is about early signs. And in young children in particular, a certain amount of OCD-like thinking or behaviors is really normative. And so if you're a child who has a little bit of magical thinking that seems a little like OCD-ish or over superstitious, it's not always a sign of a problem necessarily. It can be that's like a typical developmental stage. And so it's important when it comes to OCD in particular, it's kind of important not to just like grab one thing and say, okay, like they must have OCD. Like think about young kids who like to hear the same bedtime story day in and day out until like the parent is so sick of it, but the kid wants to hear it again. And that's, it's rigid, it's compulsive in a sense, or they have a good night ritual, right? Like I want to have you say the special words that you say every night, and I'm going to say it back to you, and we're going to do it the same way, and anything else feels wrong. And it is compulsive in a sense, but it's sort of normative compulsive. The things that I would be looking at are when you start to see a level of rigidity that starts to interfere with normal behavior and function. Because having a bedtime ritual, like I just described, very normal. Having a 45-minute every night bedtime ritual like that, and otherwise I cannot go to sleep, starts to be a problem. Having food preferences, very normal. Only being able to eat one particular thing or on one particular dish starts to be an issue. So I would be looking for those places, or thinking about, are there places where the compulsivity or the rigidity, whatever the domain of it is, like, you could be preoccupation with cleanliness and hygiene. It could be worry about bad things happening. It could be a feeling of responsibility for things that are not really your responsibility. Those are all signs of OCD, but you want to be asking, like, does it start to be something that's interfering, or is it just sort of like, a little bit of a quirk that maybe is not such a reason to be concerned?
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think as a behavioral pediatrician, those are some of those key things that we ask about when we're taking a good history. How is the child functioning? Because again, some of these, as you mentioned, these behaviors are normative depending on the child's developmental age. But that's really where we need to be focusing on. Is it getting in the way of that child doing the things that they need to be doing, day in and day out? That was a great question. Thank you, whoever sent that one in. Let me see. Kind of piggybacking off of that, one of my children with behavior issues has the rigidity that you mentioned, like routine structure, likes patterns. He has issues at school when other kids follow the rules. How do we sort out if this is possible anxiety? He does have ADHD or something else.
He has issues at school when other kids follow the rules,
Or maybe don't.
or maybe it's don't. Okay,
Yeah.
so, right. Maybe it's don't. That would be more typical for an anxious child. Maybe is that more of a problem with the ones who are not.
Yep. Meant to say don't follow rules. Yep.
I meant to say don't follow the rules. Yes. Yeah. No. That's certainly something that we see quite frequently, and flexibility is not an easy thing to teach. It's a goal, but it's a hard thing to teach. And the other thing that I think it's important to sort of bear in mind is that repetition and patterns and rules, these things provide a sense of control over the environment, over your life. And the more anxious a person is, whether that's a young child or an adult, the more anxious a person is, the more their need for control tends to grow. Because think about it like this. If you go through life feeling like, everything's going to work out fine in the end, that's sort of your attitude to life. Well, you're blessed and that's great. And if that's true, then it matters a little bit less exactly how they work out well. Right? It's like, it's fine, it'll work out okay, and it doesn't matter that much exactly how. But when you go through life feeling like there are so many ways that things could be terrible and awful, and I'll feel awful, something catastrophic will happen, and everything feels so fraught, and there's maybe one way that things do go okay, the thing that I know, the thing that I've done before, the thing that's predictable, then you really want to be in control to make sure that it's going that way, because everything else feels terrible. And so you get a very elevated kind of control. A lot of anxious kids are going to be described as a little bossy and a little over controlling, like the kid in class who's like freaking out if somebody else isn't following the rules. And it's like, well, what do you care? But you do care because you want to know that things are chugging along in the way that you want. And so what I think you want to strive for, in a sense, is a balance, meaning trying to deny any sense of control is not going to go well, right? To just expect somebody to be completely flexible and say, well, you don't get to, decide anything, or things like that, that's not going to go well for an anxious child. And so allowing a certain amount of control is actually okay. Maybe that means you let the child follow some of these patterns a little bit more rigidly, etc. And at the same time, you also want, that's sort of why it's a balance, because you also want to be communicating that it is okay to tolerate a certain amount of distress, that it is okay to deal with the things that are outside of our control. And so you pick maybe one area. I wouldn't try to change everything at once, but you pick maybe one area and you focus on that. And you say, like, here, we're not going to follow the pattern, or we're not going to do it your way, or something like that. And that's going to be hard for you because you like it the other way and it makes them uncomfortable. But, I'm pretty sure you're going to be able to handle it. And so we're going to do it like this. But you also have to sort of be accepting of the fact that there are going to be some freakouts along the way. Just like you're sort of accepting of the fact that there are some kids in the class who are not going to follow the rules every time. And you do your best to address it, but you also realize that's how kids are. You also want to be accepting of the fact that there's going to be some kids who will freak out sometimes. And okay, that happened. And, you kind of get past it, because it's not a one-day change. You're trying to sort of develop this feeling of, I can handle it when things don't exactly go my way.
Mm-hmm.
And I can sort of recognize the boundaries of my control, but also, that's kind of a long-term goal and you're working toward it, not able to sort of flip that switch overnight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so good. Thank you for that. Meg commented in reference to earlier, oh, yes, I have learned to listen, quote, in the moment of chaos or fighting. Don't judge, don't accuse, just listen. And then I think about the best way to respond, not react, and often talk to them at bedtime or whatever the issue is. It took 10 years of parenting to learn this skill. Thank you, Meg, for sharing that.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
So I have another question here, and it's a nice introduction because I heard you in your explanation talk about accepting and confidence. And of course, you gave that wonderful strategy of, you want to support your child, use those supportive statements. So this one comes from Jamie. I think I understand the communication distinction between demanding and supporting. Can you talk more about applying that distinction where a child would willingly avoid social recreational activities if allowed to do so? So not really required to participate, otherwise would stay home otherwise. But, it's not like forcing him to go on a roller coaster, but it's just going outside and doing some social activities sometimes.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like I always preface all my answers before I get to the actual.
No, it's good. It's good.
Well, maybe it's good or maybe it's not. I don't know. But I guess I want to say one thing here also about, and it's a principle that will apply even beyond like recreational things or social activities. I think it has other applications also. But what I want to say is I think it's important to distinguish between the like kind of the musts and the maybes, right, or the optional. A good metaphor for this is food, right? Like some kids will eat anything, but not every kid. Some kids are a lot more restricted in what they will eat. They're much more picky, and that's okay, right? It's okay to be picky. You don't have to eat everything. It only becomes a real problem when you're so limited that maybe your health is going to be jeopardized, or it's really interfering in some other way, in a meaningful way, right? Like if you can't go to any play dates because you won't have your one food that you eat there, it starts to be a problem. But if you don't like to try everything and you eat fewer foods than other people, maybe that's fine. And the same thing can apply to the social and recreational domain. Children are going to vary a lot in their social motivation, if you will, the need for social engagement. And people are really different in how they experience social interactions. There are people who seem to be energized by encountering other people and spending time with them. And then there are also people who are the opposite. They're like drained by the interaction with other people. It's like some feed off the energy and some feel like they're depleted and it's taking energy from them. And so we're going to have very different levels of like interest and engagement. And just like with the food, you kind of want to think about what is like really necessary and what is more optional. And so, being completely isolated, that's a real problem. But having fewer friends than somebody else maybe is not that much of a problem. Now, having said that, let's go to the actual question, which was about like this distinction between demanding and supporting. And we'll try to put it into this context. I think there's a lot of different ways that we do communicate like in a demanding way. And I want to highlight like two in particular that I mean when I say demanding. One is when you are communicating that what your child feels, wants, thinks, or like what they experience is either false or unacceptable, right? Like, they don't want to go they don't want to go on the play date. And your reaction is suggesting that either that's not true or it's not okay that they feel that way. And you don't have to be a mean person to fall into this trap. Like it sounds a little mean, but actually you don't have to be mean at all. Because, for example, when we start going down the road of, oh, but it's going to be so much fun. You're going to love it, right? It's going to be so great if you just try it. And I get why you would want to say that. And there may even be a time and a moment to say that, but lost in saying that is the idea that actually maybe for this particular kid at this particular moment, it doesn't seem like fun, right? Like that's not what they're experiencing now. So one kind of demand is when we're not able to acknowledge that this is what they experience and that that's a legitimate way to feel. Maybe you'd love it if they felt differently, but it's a legitimate way to feel because we don't get to choose how we feel. The other way in which we can be demanding is when we communicate the expectation that somebody act as though they don't feel that, even though they do, right? So like maybe I'm accepting the fact that you feel it, but it doesn't matter. You have to act as though you don't. And that also is, quite literally a form of demand. Like I want you to do this anyway or regardless. The way to stay away from that trap, I think, is to really use that formula of support, to start by accepting the fact that your child doesn't have that interest right now. And maybe explore that with them a little bit, right? Like, what is it that is making that not desirable for them? I don't know. Like, is it just that they're not having it? They don't think it'll be fun? Is it that they're tired? Is it that they're anxious about how it'll go? But when you start with some acceptance of it, it becomes a lot easier to actually explore that with them. And they become more open to telling you more about it. Whereas if what they hear from you is either like, that's not okay, or you have to, do it anyway, well, they're not going to feel very motivated to share more about how they feel. And so I think it's important to start with that acceptance. And then, the confidence piece is confidence about you. When we talk about in space, when we talk about confidence, we're talking about the parent. I believe that you could handle X, or I think that it would be okay. It doesn't mean that you're going to get up and do it right now. It's not confidence in your actions. It's confidence that you can handle it, that you can be okay. And you have to play the long game here. In other words, instead of making it all about this particular event, right? Like, are you going to go or not? You take a slightly longer term approach and you're communicating that support. You're continuing to offer those opportunities. So don't stop offering the opportunities. And that's a mistake that sometimes, we fall into, is like, we assume you're not going to want something. And so we don't even suggest it, right? Again, it's a little bit like with food. If your kid doesn't like peas, you never offer them peas. But you know what? Tastes actually change, especially in children. Tastes actually do change. Maybe you do want to try it again a little bit later. And it's the same with the social stuff. So you keep offering the opportunities, but at least for those things that are more on the optional side of the equation, they're not really critical to function, then it's an opportunity, but it's also, that means that it's an opportunity that might be rejected this time. And I think if you do that, it becomes much more likely that maybe next week or 2 weeks from now, maybe they do give it a try, as opposed to if you really try to zoom in on this one event and make sure that they do it and you put everything toward that, they dig in more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I hope that was useful, Jamie. Thank you so much for that question. I have a couple more, Ellie, so hopefully we're good on time still. Okay.
I'm okay.
Okay, good. Thank you. So this one comes from, let's see, I'm going to pull up Jessica's. So do you have any tips for addressing a child's recurrent verbalized fear/anxiety, afraid of death and dying? I try to acknowledge the fear and careful not to dismiss, but don't know how to be to have a more productive conversation and help limit the perseverating.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is have the conversation about death or about, dying, like the conversation about it, I would have not when they're in that moment of I'm worried about it and scared about it. And, and then you're trying to talk to them about death, but they're scared in this moment. What they want from you in that moment is just reassurance. And they want to feel, reassured and better, but they're not really going to be in a place that allows them to like have a conversation about death. Whatever style conversation you might have, different parents are going to talk about death in very different ways. But whatever content you want to deliver, I would say do it not in that moment. And then in the moment when they are feeling just freaked out about it and they're scared, that is another place to take a more supportive approach to it. Meaning you can say something like, I get it. That's a really scary thought. And it is a really scary thought. Like, not just kids are scared of death, right? Like, everybody's scared of death. It's a really scary thought. I think you can handle that fear. I think you can be okay. And then they're like, yeah, but, well, but what about, or, I'm freaking out about it. And that's a place to actually put action behind the words. I think you can handle it, by saying, well, I think I'm not going to help you if I just keep repeating this. So I'm not going to talk about it more right now, but maybe tomorrow afternoon, let's sit down and have a conversation about what your worry is, because you're much more likely to have that successfully if you're not doing it in response to and with a kid who's in the grip of a fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Jessica, hope that was helpful. I have a couple more here that I can see from Facebook users. So I'm sorry, I'm not on Facebook right now to see who actually posted, but I hope that we are answering your question. And I have one more that was sent in that I want to get to before we end. Okay. So good evening. I'm sorry to join the conversation late. My question is about repeated anxiety behaviors. Can they become a habit or used to manipulate? My son's emotional regulation has always been his biggest struggle. I'm thrilled that due to excellent support from family, school, and Dr. Bauer, thanks, he has come on in leaps and bounds. However, he has a repeated behavior that keeps popping up. He can be reactive and very negative about himself. I find that it occurs when he doesn't want to, and that's all I have.
Interesting. So your understanding is that the behavior is being negative about himself? That's the repeated behavior? Is that how you understood that?
I'm not sure, because I feel like the comment was cut off. So anyone, whoever the person was, if you're still on watching, can you please clarify that? I want to make sure that we answer this in the right way.
Well, I can start with one thing from the first part of the question, actually, which was part of that question was like, can a repeated behavior become, a habit or used to manipulate? And
yes.
Maybe I'll try to address at least that part a little bit. Habit, sure, of course, any repeated behavior in a sense is like a habit, but I want to focus more on the question of like manipulation. And there's two things I want to say here. The first is that if by manipulation we mean faking, right? Like, I'm doing this because it's like, not because that's what I really feel or what I really think, but because I want to sort of push you into the corner of like doing something. I would say maybe that's not impossible, but it would be low on my list of interpretations for why a child is being negative about themselves, or why they're being sad, or why they're being anxious. I think more times than not, by a lot, they're communicating what they actually think or feel in that moment. And it might not be the be all and end all of everything they always feel, but in that moment, that's what they feel. I think it's more likely that it's genuine than that it's not genuine. But the second point I wanted to make is that, in a sense, everybody's manipulative, right? Like, it's not a dirty word. All it means is that sometimes, we want a certain outcome, and we have learned that a particular behavior might lead to a particular outcome. And so if we want that behavior or that outcome, that's the behavior that we're going to do. We take kids, we throw them into the world, and we set up that world for them in a sense. And if they have learned our responses, and they've learned like which levers lead to what in our responses, that's because that's how we have taught them through our behavior. And so, I just want to say it's not, it's not like a bad thing that people manipulate. That's just how we go through life. But, in terms of the like negative thinking, I would suspect that probably that is what the child is actually experiencing in that moment, rather than thinking of it as a manipulation.
Yes. So, thank you, Jessica. He can be reactive, very negative about himself. I find that it occurs when he doesn't want to deal with things. It's like a get out clause. I'm struggling to work with this.
Yeah. Well, maybe the solution is less in trying to figure out if it's genuine or not, if it's like a get out of jail free and not real, or if it's real. Again, I tend to assume that that is what the child is experiencing in that moment. But maybe the solution is more in it not being the get out of jail free card. In other words, it's possible to have an expectation from a child, even in a moment that they are feeling bad about themselves. And you can sort of separate the two things. You can, address with them either then or a little bit later, address with them those negative feelings that they have, without it meaning that if you have those negative feelings, then we can't expect, X, Y, or Z. We can't really expect you to cope and to function. Because I think what we were trying to teach through that is, yeah, we all have negative feelings, and that's okay. And we talk about them and we deal with them, but also we cope with them. We function despite them, and not like function until they go away.
Right. Good point. Two more, if that's all right. I have one here. I have OCD myself. I've received behavioral therapy and also take medication, which have both helped a lot. However, I recognize that I probably won't ever be, quote, normal. My compulsion is mostly with germs and cleanliness. I have a child with ADHD and anxiety, and my tendencies, repeated thoughts of, do I need to clean this now, have rubbed off on him. Do you have any advice on how to decrease the impact of me on him? I try to talk to him about my own situation without over talking about it.
Yeah. Well, that's a really touching question. And I think, what I would say is you don't actually give your kids OCD. I think if your child was born with a predisposition and kind of tendency toward OCD, there's a chance that they will develop it. And maybe what it looks like might be informed a little bit by the kinds of things that they see in the parents. If a child is born without that predisposition or vulnerability or tendency, you're not going to make them have OCD because you do. I wouldn't overblame myself for a child, having OCD, just like I wouldn't give myself too much credit for a child not having OCD. But what I would say is, I would say two things. One is maybe it's a gift, actually, that you do have this, if you see this starting to emerge in the child, because A, you know it deeply from your own experience, and B, you've learned so much because you've been in therapy and you know about it. And I would say maybe it can be a little bit of a joint project to sort of fight the OCD a little bit, to fight those thoughts. And doing it, when it's hard for you is hard, but it's a worthy thing to do for your child. So you could take small things and, I don't know if it's hand washing or something like that. And, you kind of think back to the stuff you did in behavioral therapy, and, you kind of try to work on that together with the child. I think it can be a very positive process. And the second part is around the accommodation, which, of course, is also really important. And if you find yourself accommodating the child's growing worries about germs or cleanliness, that's a very good place to say, maybe I feel just as much about it like he does, and I have the same thoughts about cleanliness, but that doesn't mean that I should be accommodating his symptom, because that's only likely to contribute to the maintenance of the symptom rather than the opposite. So, kind of go against your own personal grain a little bit by not overly accommodating the child's sort of focus on cleanliness.
Okay, great. Thank you. Wow, there are lots of questions coming in as we're wrapping up. I have another question that was sent in, so I want to make sure that I ask this. How do you handle social anxiety resulting from constant rejection and corrections for neurodivergent kids like those with ADHD? It's really hard when society and other kids are like that, and I'm trying to support and reassure, but then they get rejected again. My kids know I love them and believe in them, but that doesn't seem to be enough.
Yeah, it's so painful when kids have that experience. And I think it is important to acknowledge that an anxiety symptom or an anxiety disorder is present when the anxiety is out of sync with the reality, right? Like if you're about to be hit by a car in the street and you're anxious in that moment, that's not an anxiety disorder, right? Like that's normal anxiety.
Yes.
And if you are in an environment that is actually not safe for you, or maybe it's physically safe for you, but it's not really emotionally safe for you because people bully you or people really respond negatively to you, etc., and you have anxiety about that situation, then yes, it's social anxiety, but also it is warranted in a sense. And so I'm sure that this parent is doing this already, but of course, we want to do everything we can to ensure that there is a safe atmosphere that we're sending the child into. And we can't control everything, but at least the extremes we can try our best to control. So if there's like active bullying or really mean-spirited things that are happening, etc., it's just really important to advocate on behalf of that child and, you know, seek to create as positive an environment as possible.
Right.
I would also think about what are the other contexts or settings that I can have this child be in where they will be more accepted. Maybe there's a social skills group that the child can be part of, for example, once a week or something, where it'll be moderated by somebody and, you know, we're all there kind of learning social skills, but it's a place where they won't have the same level of rejection. If one club or extracurricular or whatever is not really a good place for them, then I would try to find a different one that can be a better place, you know, for them. Because, you know, with a child with autism or other differences, sometimes it's going to take a long time for them to develop the real skills to be able to navigate those social situations really well, and that puts a target on their back, unfortunately. And so, you know, think about what are the other contexts that I can create for this child so they have moments in the week. So it's not just mom or dad. You know, I have moments in the week, an hour here, an hour there, where I am accepted, where people, you know, do accept me. And you try to see how the child can play to their strengths. Like, what are the things that they are best at, that they are kind of good at, and try to let them play to those strengths. And then, yes, we also want to, alongside trying to improve the social skills, we do also want to be sort of communicating to the child that we can handle some difficult situations as well, because the reality is there may be more difficult situations down the road, and, you know, we can't make those go away. So we're also trying to communicate that, right? Like, it's, yeah, maybe it'll be, maybe one day will be uncomfortable, maybe another day will be better, and we sort of handle those uncomfortable moments. But I think the other parts are also really important.
Right. I do too. Thank you for that. And thanks for that question that was sent in. Okay. We are at 47 minutes. So I want to be cognizant of time. There are two very quick but very powerful questions here. So I'm just going to ask them and then we'll wrap up for tonight. Next one from Jessica. Any resources or tips for dealing with ADHD/anxiety behavior of skin picking?
Well, I'm just going to point to a resource that's going to be a resource for so many things, and that is the Anxiety and Depression Association of America's website, adaa.org. I think it's .org. Yeah, adaa.org. And on that website, there are so many resources for every problem in this domain, in this area broadly. I would go there, and it's a place to find a professional in case if you need that kind of help, but also just to get more information or, be able to point toward additional resources. So I would check that out for sure.
Okay, great. And it's adaa.org, right? Okay, so that's there scrolling for you just to take a look. Thank you so much. Okay, and then I think we have time for one more quick question. Let me just pull it up here. What does a conversation sound like with siblings of a child with anxiety and or outbursts when the sibling feels like they aren't getting as much of my attention because managing the outbursts seemed to take so much time and attention? Thank you to whoever sent that in, because that is a common struggle.
It is a very common struggle. And here also we need a little bit of balance. On the one hand, we want to be doing our best to make sure that the other sibling who's not the squeaky wheel is not losing out too excessively on the parent's time or attention, etc. And on the other hand, we also kind of want to acknowledge that when in a family somebody has a problem, that is going to affect the family, right? Just like if a child has a physical illness and needs special care or something like that, it is going to affect. And it's okay for kids to learn that. You don't need to be perfectly fair all the time. But in terms of the conversation, I think it varies a lot depending on the age of the sibling and a little bit maybe also on the relationship between the siblings. But, you know, it's really different if you're talking about a really young kid or an older, more mature one. I would encourage a pretty frank and open conversation, but in an age-appropriate way, meaning it's okay to, you know, we know that sometimes your sister or your brother or whatever has struggles and has challenges and feels really upset. And we know that that can take over things sometime. And just acknowledging that for the sibling, that you see it, is already so validating that often that's like 90% of what they want, is just for you to sort of recognize it. And then, you know, you can follow it though by also saying, like, let's make a plan for us, or let's see what would be good for you. And you're not promising that that's never going to happen anymore, because you can't make that promise. So I wouldn't, you know, you can't say, you know, from now on, it's all going to be completely fair. No, I wouldn't make that promise, but I would say, but it's also, you know, you're just as important. And I want to make sure that we're also thinking about what you need. And so maybe we can make a plan for something that we're going to do or some time, and you try to do your best to really fulfill that, right? So maybe that means getting some additional help or supports, or to parents working on it or something like that. But in general, the like short answer to the question is, I think a not an apology, but a frank kind of conversation about the situation is probably a good way to go.
Yes, that's really wonderful. Somebody here said, thank you for this information tonight. So much helpful insight. I would have to agree wholeheartedly. And I do want to remind you guys, like, again, if you're here and you haven't read this book, please go pick it up. I think it is so well written. I love, there was a passage where you talk about the Rolex analogy, the ping pong analogy, the bicycle analogy. I mean, like, the analogies are really, it drives home points in your book. So if you're curious about it and haven't read it, please go get it.
And yes. If you do read it and you like it, leave a
review. Yes. Jessica said, thank you. Ordering book on Amazon now. Yay. Yes, you will not regret it. Okay, let me just scroll through. I think we got everything. So I promised you guys that we're going to do a quick drawing. So I'm going to, hold on, let me see. We're going to draw this right now. And let's see who wins this prize. Oh my goodness. Oh, there we go. Hey, Jessica, you just won the little prize there. So we had advertised that on in the parenting discussion group. So headquarters will get you that shortly. Okay. Thank you for participating today and being such a great interaction guest here on the show, because obviously when we invite special guests, it's so much more rich when we have this interaction and this discussion. Okay. Well, Ellie, is there any last minute thoughts that I'm going to just ask you? Because I know we asked you a lot of questions, but if maybe there's one or two points that you really want parents to take away in the context of this book and what the work you do, what would they be?
Well, I think they would be, if your child has anxiety, A, it's not your fault. B, you may be able to help them to overcome it. And I think my last parting thought would just be a reminder to all of us that the world is chock full of kids who used to have an anxiety problem, who used to have an anxiety disorder. It is possible to overcome these problems. So if they have a problem, get help. You know, maybe it's a therapist, maybe it's a book, maybe it's something else, but something about it, because it's actually really possible to overcome these challenges.
Yeah, it is. And while in the moment it can feel very stifling, I think the bottom line is ask for help. Don't forget to go to your pediatrician, talk to them about it. They're going to be your first kind of point, because they know the therapists, they know the people in your community that they can refer to. But while you're waiting, read this book. Like I said, this is such a great book. And again, I just want to remind all of you that I know that this time of year, especially coming out, if it's fair to say, coming out of the pandemic, I know that so many kids have had, and parents have experienced, a lot of anxiety. So there is hope out there. I hope that this discussion has provided some useful insight into what you can do. And again, that's why this program is so unique and amazing. It's because it is chock full of things that you can start doing today to help support your child get through and cope, because that's what we really want to give them, is that lifelong skill. Because, the goal is never to get rid of anxiety. Anxiety is biological based. It's there to keep us safe, keep us prepared, help us get motivated. But again, when we can channel that and get through it, it also helps us become resilient. So, yes. Yes. Oh, and somebody said I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that it's not my fault. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. I do want to tell you all, have a good night. I do want to remind you that my Teach Me ADHD course is still enrolling until Monday. I hope that I have one more mini class simulation this weekend. I know a lot of you have been in my class, but if you have friends, family, or others who would benefit, again, learning child-friendly ways of dealing with their ADHD so they can combat those ants, those negative thoughts, and really work with you to connect, communicate, and collaborate together, and have a game plan so that you can come out together on the other side to feel good about living with ADHD and thriving. Please consider joining my course. We're enrolling now. Okay, so thank you so much, everybody, for staying on tonight. What a wonderful discussion. I have missed these so much. Stay tuned. We're going to announce our next book here shortly. But until then, good night.
Good.